Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So how is everybody? I've been talking a lot about values, morals and ethics, and surprise, surprise, I'm going to talk about it some more today. Now some of you might be going, why is he banging on like this about what values, morals and ethics? Now, part of the reason is because we're currently in a time where we're facing some really complex dilemmas within our communities. Many of our communities are split. Okay, so I'm doing a bit of a rehash from the last one. But let me bring it to another level, and that is that values, morality, and ethics are closely intertwined with our well-being. Physically, yes, but most importantly, emotional well-being. You might go, well, how's that work? Well, let me explain that a little bit. As a therapist, I frequently, almost on a daily basis, have many people seeing me who are actually grappling with the emotional consequences of a moral dilemma. And so what do they look like? Well, essentially, we can look at it on three levels. Firstly, we can look at the personal, we can look at the relationship, and we can look at the community level. Okay? Now, let me focus a bit about this whole issue at a personal level. So how does a person get psychologically affected by a moral dilemma? Well, let me give you one very cut and dried example of that. And that is the person who is either contemplating or is actually having an affair. That in itself, when some of you, a lot of you are going to go, well, what's the dilemma? You just don't do it. Well, in many respects, that's easier said than done for many people. Okay, so what does that rely on? Okay, so let me give you another example. There are rules that says drugs are illegal. Okay? Now, most teenagers at some point are facing the choice between sticking to the rule or going with their own beliefs. And some parents might go, well, they shouldn't have beliefs about that. It's illegal, so they shouldn't do it. And perhaps technically that's right. But the reality is most of us have been teenagers and we don't necessarily adhere to the rules. Most of the time we're going to test them. Okay? So some teenagers will go, okay, the rule's not to do it, so I won't do it. My experience is that they're in the minority, folks. They're not the majority. We test and bend and squeeze our way through the framework of rules that we have. And I think in many respects, as I said in the first episode, do we need more rules? And my view is probably not so much as we need a clearer engagement with values. Okay. Now, some people might go, well, drugs are harmful. And by and large, that's true, but so is alcohol, so is gambling, so is sitting in front of a computer console and screen for hours a day, playing computer games, watching pornography. Many things that we as human beings do create harm for ourselves. In some instances, both physically as well as psychologically. So let me pick up the thread. So personally, I'm confronting moral dilemmas that lead to emotional consequences. So the third element in this is essentially the fact that moral development is also, in my view, critically linked to emotional development, especially maturity. It's my view, the more emotionally mature we are, the more likely it is that we're going to make more moral decisions. Now, I'm going to wait with bated breath until I get some feedback from people going, no, that's rubbish. All right. And again, one of the things that we can do is we can begin to test this. Right? Some of them are more simple. Okay, so let me take this argument into the realm of relationships. Okay, like the affair. But there's other ones that are less moralistic in a way. For example, the issue, should men and women have equal leave for childcare? That's a moral dilemma. Should we be able to manufacture affordable, holistic and homeopathic synthetic products? And should they be branded as such if they come from chemicals, but these chemicals are identical to that found in nature? Now that's a fairly complex one, right? There is a question about the scientific basis for a start with homeopathic medicines, and also the issue about supplements, which work and which don't work and so on. So it's a really complex notion. But again, some of this begins to move into the more organisational space as well. So we go from the relationship to the organisational, the community stuff. So, the big one on the table at the moment is Glasgow, the whole issue about climate change and how we're going to manage it. We seem to be at odds with a lot of our politicians, especially in the United States and Australia. In our political scene, we have a government that seems to do very little about the realities of climate change. They keep avoiding doing constructive things around it. In fact, the opposite is true. They continue to promote fossil fuels and putting very little into an alternative infrastructure that could actually create more jobs. Now, this is not opinion, this is fact. Okay, this is one of the issues that comes up. And so I come back to this whole notion of moral maturity actually connects with emotional maturity. And one of the consequences of that is that if I make the right decisions that reflect my personal values within the context of a sense of greater good, then I'm going to be less conflicted. So all of us are human beings. So let me go back to the personal one. Okay, the issue about an affair. Okay, so I meet somebody, conferences, business, we exchange team members, and there is a person that I'm strongly attracted to. The catch is I'm married, and in fact the reality is I'm, actually quite happily married. Right? But there is this attraction to this other person. So what do? The other person's quite inviting, in fact, quite seductive and flirty. The other person's single. I'm not. So the question arises, how do I make a decision about this? Now, this is where psychological dynamics comes into it. And in psychology, one of the things that underpins maturity is the notion that I can delay gratification and I am tolerant of frustration. Right? So even if I'm in a relationship where my physical intimacy isn't high, right, but the marriage overall is okay, we just need to work on that bit, I can make a decision which is, do I jeopardize everything I have with the person that I'm married to, all my children, all my assets, all that, for sexual gratification? Interesting dilemma, right? So let me take it to the other end. Science is telling us that climate change is real. We need to take some very active steps in managing and reducing carbon emissions. So on a personal level, even if I don't agree with it, do I go, okay, well, that's what they're telling me, so I need to take a look at my behaviour that contributes to the climate problem, or do I just ignore it and run along? Okay. Now, emotionally, if I'm psychologically mature, I may take the route that, well, it's not such a big deal. So instead of driving, a turbocharged V8, I'll go down to an electric car, or I might even just go down to a 6-cylinder or 4-cylinder car. Ultimately, if you got a muscle car, the chances are you're going to run across cops and, have some strife with the police because you tend to be a bit of a lead foot. Okay. So, again, I'm making a little bit of light of this, but the reality is that in every decision to where I go, do I go to the right, to the left, good, bad, I'm confronting a moral dilemma that is inextricably tied to my psychological maturity and ultimately well-being. So that's the next step. The more mature I am, right, psychologically, the more resilient I'm going to be. And this is really, really important, and we fail often to see the connections between those elements. So strong values, a good moral framework, and an embedded ethical framework that I can apply leads itself to, for me, to be calmer, to be more grounded, to be more intact within my relationship with myself and therefore in my relationship with others. Sometimes when we are stuck in making decisions, we get to the point where we're either highly anxious about it and we're trying to avoid it, or we get depressed because we don't know what to do with it. So we're frustrated, angry, and then we internalize it. So the thing that emerges out of this conflict around values, morality, and ethics are often a disharmony within ourselves that should and needs to be resolved if we're going to be okay. So, a couple of things about emotional maturity. Well, the first thing is emotional immaturity means that we're going to either avoid when we are being hurt in a situation by somebody that we are vulnerable to, or we're going to become disproportionately enraged with how dare they hurt me, or I'm just not going to really address it ever. And so I carry the conflict internally. So in psychotherapy, we talk about defense mechanisms, internalizing, suppressing, repressing. Introspection doesn't really come into this at this point. We often begin to do things to ourselves as a way of avoiding dealing with the actual problem. Self-harm, for example, is often a result of certain dilemmas that I'm experiencing to which I'm reacting to emotionally, and in order to resolve the emotional pain, I hurt myself. Now, if we're going to create people who are emotionally resilient, we need to help them from a very early age to be emotionally mature. And so there are 3 benchmarks for emotional maturity that I'm going to pick up in the next podcast. But I'm going to flag them now because I want everybody to have a think about this, to reflect on it. Okay? And in philosophy, we talk about the 3 cardinal virtues of emotional maturity. Now, the first one is that we need to have a capacity to explain why we're upset or what the issue is for us. The second one is to have the capacity to stay calm. Becoming a raging bull is not useful to especially yourself, let alone the other person that you're trying to deal with.